Subscribers to The Australian hear episodes first and get access to all Shari's work on this topic, as well as unrivaled news, politics, investigations, sport and culture. Go to theaustralian.com.au/Wuhan to find out more.
I'm Shari Markson, and I've spent most of the past 2 years investigating the origins of COVID-19.
The Chinese city of Wuhan is under quarantine as the outbreak of the coronavirus worsens.
The federal government has raised its travel advice for the Chinese provinces to Wuhan and Hubei to level 4.
This is the front line of the epidemic in Wuhan, and it is bleak.
I'm declaring a public health emergency of international concern over the global outbreak of novel coronavirus.
What really happened in Wuhan?
David Asher was the lead investigator at the US State Department, tasked with examining the origins of COVID-19. Asher has led investigations into money laundering, sanction evasion, nuclear proliferation, and weapons of mass destruction in Iran, Pakistan, and North Korea. While he's a traditional Republican, Asher has worked for both sides of politics. He served in the Bush administration under Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage, reporting to Secretary of State Colin Powell, and he's also worked under the Obama administration, rejoining the State Department in 2014, where he led an interagency task force to hunt down Islamic State extremists and develop a strategy to destroy the terrorist group, including depriving them of finances and an economic support base. Asher supported Trump's position on China, but having dealt with him personally in New York real estate finance, he decided against officially joining his administration as a political appointee. He signed on as a senior subject matter expert contractor for the State Department. Asher was brought on board by Assistant Secretary of State Tom Donano to lead a covert investigation within the Arms Control Verification and Compliance Bureau, which is often known as the AVC team. His task was to investigate the origins of COVID-19. And Asher would end up playing a crucial role in uncovering intelligence that led the trail of some of the earliest cases back to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. David, take me back to how you got involved in investigating the origins of COVID-19.
Well, my job was to lead our investigations and intelligence gathering related to arms control topics at the State Department. And, that includes, of course, nuclear, biological, chemical weapons, globally, development, as well as design, prototype, build programs in various countries, and then also to look at strategic missile and space forces. The biology aspect of this was part of the job from the start. When I started on February 1st, we were following what was going on in Wuhan daily, just through our typical daily intelligence briefings and other cable traffic coming in for our embassy, which we were following. But my focus really shifted full time to COVID at the end of September of last year, end of September of 2020. And the reason that it focused then rather than earlier was that we had just had we had an upcoming biological weapons convention meeting in Geneva. It was scheduled for December, I believe, as I recall. And that December meeting meant that we had to start to prepare ourselves.
David, you had spent most of that year looking into whether China was complying with the Biological Weapons Convention.
Yeah, so we'd have to do these compliance reviews for all of our treaties, including the Biological Weapons Convention. And our compliance review, our annual compliance review, takes many months to occur. And our deadline is typically April 1st of the following year. To do it successfully, especially in light of the suspicions surrounding COVID-19 origins, We started in October, officially, at the beginning of October of 2020, a full-out effort to look into allegations that had been made, including by the Secretary of State and the President, that there was some sort of illicit origin surrounding the outbreak of COVID, that it might have involved a laboratory leak, that it might have been involved a laboratory leak from a laboratory that had involved some People's Liberation Army activity. These were all allegations, but I want to make it very clear that when we started with the assumption that this came from natural zoonosis. And very early on, I called over to the National Institutes of Health, who a personal friend of mine who's an associate director, and I said, can you just give me the file so we understand why Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins are insisting this came out of Nature, despite what the President and the Secretary of State said? And she said, oh, sure, we'll work on it. We'll get you something. They never did produce it. They never gave us anything. And one of the things that startled us early on, as we went and looked through all of the intelligence and State Department traffic, we have a lot of information, including unclassified cables. Because of COVID, a lot of our communications had gone to OpenNet, as we call it, unclassified. So we were getting a lot of reporting from Wuhan and from sources there through state channels, not intelligence, that was unclassified, and we were able to even look at it at home. And we were shocked by the fact that we couldn't see, and our embassy is having great trouble finding any evidence for a natural zoonosis. In fact, they were having trouble finding any evidence the Chinese were even looking for a natural zoonosis. This I haven't mentioned before, but it's significant. After all the work that we did in the ensuing 3 months, October through December of 2020, where we poured over literally maybe as much as 100,000 pieces of information with our team, we were shocked to find almost no indication in our information that our government had in its possession that the Chinese had seriously done an investigation themselves as to where COVID-19 had originated.
And did you come across any evidence that supported the theory the virus had a natural origin, that it could have come from human contact with an infected animal?
There was very little indication, other than the things that they later told the WHO about sampling 80,000 animals. I never saw actual evidence of 80,000 animals. The Chinese say that. I don't know that anyone's really received any serological or blood samples or sequences related to those 80,000 animals. I wouldn't be surprised if they did it, but it would surprise me even more if they didn't, if we were to find that out. And that's something that should be a central issue as this intelligence review moves toward this last 45 days of its sprint. But the point is that we started with the understanding that our government official position was a natural zoonosis, and that there had to be evidence to amplify that fact. We were shocked as we proceeded with our investigation to find next to no evidence to underline the assertions that were made by our NIH colleagues and by other government agencies who insisted that this thing, including at the level of the Director of National Intelligence in April of 2020, came out of Nature. In fact, when we looked further at the sources for some of these allegations that were made, and I will call the Director of National Intelligence analysis to be more like an allegation, because there was no real proof. It was like we talked to 3 guys and a dog, and the 3 guys told us it came out of Nature, and their names are Christian Anderson, Ralph Barrick, and Robert Gary.
David is referring to scientists who have consistently said a natural origin of COVID-19 is more likely than a lab accident. Ralph Barrick had even conducted gain-of-function research with the Wuhan Institute of Virology's well-known virologist Shi Zhengli back in 2015. The point he's making is that the intelligence community, a lot like the scientific and media, were happy to accept this assurance without closer examination.
So our experts tell us it had to come out of nature because they're the people that know the most. And of course, there's even more important expert, a guy named Peter Daszak, who's a highly regarded zoologist who works very closely with the Chinese and knows that they absolutely never, ever would lie about anything. And he's the absolute expert on bat-borne coronaviruses in the United States and their epidemiology, and that he assures us that the Chinese had provided him personally with proof to make it clear that this had come out of nature. But when we asked for this proof, when we asked the government agencies that had funded the work of EcoHealth and others, they couldn't give us that proof because they didn't have that proof. I mean, it was rather remarkable in my career that we could have so many people saying so many things with such definitive conclusiveness and have really no backup for it.
It's not the first time incorrect assumptions have been made by intelligence agencies.
It made what went on in Iraq with Saddam Hussein and WMD look like child's play, because Saddam did have WMD. He did have a nuclear program. He just happened to have given it up, probably anticipating that we might someday invade him to take it out of there. But in the case of China, we had no real solid proof based on interviews with CDC China, based on discussions with our many sources. Our embassy and our consulates around China, including Wuhan, talk to lots of people. So that the State Department doesn't collect intelligence, but we do collect information as part of our job. And so our economic and our science officers, their interaction in Wuhan had largely figured around a Wuhan Institute of Virology, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a place that our own scientific officers had visited and declared to be an unsafe facility in 2018. And that was in the wake of the public, that was in the wake of the Chinese publicly kicking the French out of their partnership at the Wuhan Institute's new campus, where they were building a state-of-the-art BSL-4 facility, which the French had led the construction of. So the context for us sending in these scientific officers was that we had heard from the French, I believe, that there was reason to be deeply concerned about what was going on there. But, the reality is, I don't even know that we visited the right laboratory. The unsafe conditions, I believe, were observed. I think that there was the group went to the new laboratory, which is different from the old laboratory. But I'm not actually clear. It's not. Maybe you would know. But the point is that even what was going on in the new laboratory, okay, which was state of the art, which had BSL 2, 3, 4 level conditions, was considered unsafe. I don't know that we had real clear access to the old laboratory, which seems to be the place that the military had started to take hold of, starting in 2017, maybe even earlier. So one of the tales of this whole odyssey studying the Wuhan Institute and its role in developing and potentially propagating coronaviruses, one of which may well have been COVID-19, is that there are two Wuhan Institutes. It's very important for people to understand that. They are related. They're part of the same organization. But Dr. Shi Jiangli, her lab is at the old Wuhan Institute of Virology, as I understand it. And I don't know that we ever really got access to that, because I think that thing was being treated like almost like a classified facility at some level. I mean, I know that there were foreigners that visited it, but the point is, when we looked for proof for zoonosis through all of the cable traffic, all of the intelligence, everything, we could find almost nothing. Absolutely nothing. And that totally contrasts with what we saw with SARS and MERS. We had very good insight that the Chinese were making a significant effort internally to try to figure out where those had come from. This time, it's like the Chinese knew where it had come from, so why bother looking? And so the focus became on the cleanup and the shutdown and the sort of reset of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But interestingly, the Wuhan Institute that was apparently shut down was the new WIV. I don't know if the old WIV ever really was shut down, even though, as we understand it, the lab leak largely emanated from that old WIV facility.
Is that on the same compound, though?
No, they're different parts. They're miles apart. The old WIV is proximate to where the first outbreak clusters were observed. You can see Charles Rixey, who's part of the DRASTIC group's research on it. It's very meticulously done. And of course, it's near the wet market, and it's on line 2, which Dr. Steve Quay, who, among many other doctors around the world, offered their assistance to us, and he was very, very observant and detailed and meticulous in his analysis, that line 2 on the subway that sort of dumps right out by the old WIV was the focus of the spread. So the accident seems to have occurred at Dr. Xi's BSL-2 and BSL-3 labs at the old Wuhan Institute.
David just mentioned DRASTIC. It's an international research group of around 25 members, although it fluctuates, and they've been investigating the origins of the virus, some of them night and day, since early in 2020. Some members of this group are anonymous, out of concern for their safety, but others are scientists. They have a strong online presence on Twitter. One of the reasons DRASTIC developed as a group is because of the reluctance of the scientific community to openly speak about the potential laboratory origin of COVID-19. I want to ask you about the scientific complicity when you were investigating the origins of the virus. Not only were you asking the NIH and the intelligence agencies for information, but you interviewed some of the world's top scientists. Mm-hmm. But yet, how difficult was it? How different was the message that they were telling you about the potential origins of the virus and the potential for a lab leak to what they were then saying publicly?
It's a good question. In some cases, it was at odds. In other cases, they truly believed that zoonosis had to be the only probable origin, but they could never really provide evidence of that. So it was always a sort of, just trust me, I'm a virologist thing. But I did interview several very noted scientists, including more than one who won the Nobel Prize in biology. And their analysis was quite interesting. In confidence, they told us that they were very concerned that there were aspects of the sequence that looked to have been doctored and that had been associated with gain-of-function-related research historically at the WIV itself, as well as at their own labs. These were people at famous universities in the United States, people I know that Rich Muller, who from Cal Berkeley, who advised us on WMD matters, knew. And their story was that the double CGG codon that Dr. Quay and Dr. Muller can point out to you better than I can was very unusual to see in nature, especially related to backborne coronaviruses. And that the family of coronaviruses that Dr. Quay and several others at much more famous levels actually had looked into coming out of associated with COVID-19, they felt that there was no natural known predecessor to it, and that even the so-called RATG13 that the Chinese declared as a predecessor was unlikely, and that this thing looked like it could have been bioengineered, not to say it was created with just pure genetic synthesis. That is a possibility, but it's unlikely. But they used serial passaging on top of a backbone such as RATG13 to enrich its pathogenicity. And this was something that, I believe in at least 3 cases, me talking to Nobel laureate level biologists who did take a look as a favor, they said they thought that there was something smelly in the sequence. And, but they would never say that publicly. I'm not going to say who said it. These people are well-known people. They don't want to be bothered because this has turned into a sort of scientific circus in the United States surrounding, especially Dr. David Baltimore, who I did not talk to, but who did come out and say that this double CGG a smoking gun in his mind. And I know he's retracted that to some extent, but I don't really think he's done that other than for the reason that he's just sick of being harassed by the media over it and by other scientists. I think that people are and China has entrapped the entire United States medical, virological, biological establishment through funding our university research programs, through using China as like a scientific playground for virology, for example, including at the Wuhan Institute, where you could work with their scientists and do almost any sort of radical gain-of-function research that you weren't allowed to do in the United States easily. And so people became entrapped in what I would call a Chinese honeypot operation. I mean, this is something I've observed in my work against Chinese intelligence services for over 30 years, that they try to entrap people, they try to make them sort of fall in love with China, going to the Great Wall, learning about Chinese culture, Chinese food, giving them money, letting them, take advantage of the excellent facilities the Chinese have built to accommodate Western visiting researchers and for their own research. It's a very sophisticated system of entrapment. And it's something that we've seen in every other technology area, by the way. I mean, we see this with IP theft, we see this with cyber, we see this with space, we see this with lasers, we see this with next generation computing and supercomputing. I mean, the Chinese have created a financial trap. They've created a sort of physical trap where you can use their laboratory facilities, in a way that would be quite radical. And then they've taken advantage of their access to foreigners to steal them dry and take apart their communications, basically suck their minds dry. And then they've also entrapped us at the financial level, where they've gotten the United States government, the Australian government, and other governments to fund a great deal of the research that they're undertaking for their own purposes, including for malevolent purposes. So, I'm not saying the Chinese are total geniuses at the government level, but I'm not talking about Chinese people here. I have lots of Chinese friends. I'm talking about the Chinese Communist government.
It's such a crucial point you raised in the middle of that answer, that at the same time that the United States had actually stopped or put a pause on gain-of-function research with coronaviruses in 2014 because of the grave risks, at the same time as that ban was underway, various United States agencies, not just the NIH, but also the Department of Defense and others, were still funding coronavirus research involving the genetic manipulation of viruses and sometimes even gain-of-function research. They were still funding it over in China and specifically at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. David, was this a deliberate decision by people like Anthony Fauci to outsource this research to China? And why do you think the decision was made to do this kind of very risky research in China, in Wuhan, rather than on U.S. soil?
Well, I mean, I think they were even able to continue to do it on U.S. soil as long as it was related to viruses. It seemed like a sort of sham ban, frankly, in my estimation. I'm not the expert on what NIH does internally. I was investigating the Chinese government, not the U.S. government. But the Chinese government certainly felt that it had the U.S. government in a position where it was somewhat prostrate. The Chinese were in a position to manipulate the U.S. government, and that the U.S. government, in the wake of this ostensible ban, had shut down some significant research inside the United States, and it had shifted into the People's Republic of China, partly as a result of that. I don't think it was necessarily all planned and deliberate and strategic. A lot of things just sort of happened. But certainly the controversy with doing gain-of-function research, which exists at every major BSL-4 lab in the United States, where there's community protests, there's all sorts of people, camped outside Fort Detrick, where the U.S. Army has its labs, and the NIH has its lab as well for BSL-4 for virulent disease research. The controversy in China doesn't exist. The Chinese people don't really have a problem with it, or if they did, the Chinese government wouldn't care. And the Chinese government is, very consciously trying to do in biotechnology what it's done in all other domains of future warfare, and develop the ways, means, and capabilities to be able to deploy biological agents, including through viruses and virus-like particles. This is like the least kept secret in the world. There was nothing at all that was classified about their intentions, and you'll ask me probably about that later. But anyone who's read the 2011 declaration the Chinese made to the Biological Weapons Convention would understand that the Chinese have a full, robust understanding of what can be done with biology, all the way up to the level of 100% synthetic biology and genetic manipulation at the level of not just DNA but RNA, which is especially menacing as in this area. And so why Fauci didn't understand the risk, is mind-boggling.
I just want to remind you about the comments that Fauci made, where he actually admits that he did this research in China to avoid an outbreak in Hoboken, New Jersey. Have a quick listen.
So you don't want to go to Hoboken, New Jersey, or to Fairfax, Virginia, to be studying the bat-human interface that might lead to an outbreak. So you go to China.
David, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. So he has an outbreak in Wuhan, and it destroys the world, and Hoboken's spared? No, Hoboken has not been spared, thanks to Dr. Fauci's noble leadership and vision of trying to outsource our most sensitive pathogenetic research that could lead to a biowarfare situation, of World War III of biology, and give it to the Chinese Communist Party to conduct through its secretive means, which, by the way, as the Washington Post has outed in its article, they were doing secret research for decades at the Wuhan Institute, it appears. I mean, it's in their actual manual on their website in Chinese, that there's all the protocols for conducting classified research and stuff. So this is again, there were so many reasons why the U.S. should have been suspicious. Our own National Academy of Sciences in 2018 had prepared a report about biology, basically synthetic biology and bioengineering in the future of warfare. And it's like a 200-page report. Fauci was certainly on the recipients list of that report.
Just to interrupt there, apart from the bioterrorism risk and apart from the risk of a lab leak, the situation was that no US agency or Australian or anyone else who was contributing to this research had any level of oversight. Nothing.
That's true. It's almost a blank slate. There was no oversight. We didn't even seem to know what our research was leading to. And Dr. Fauci denies that was gain of function. I don't know what gain of function is, but I will tell you what I observed at the NIH is gain of dysfunction. The place is out of control. It has no controls. They're giving, through HHS and NIH, they're giving like $40 billion a year out to public and private sector labs, including to foreign governments, including the Communist government of China, which is the most astonishing, startling, and disturbing thing that I learned in the last year and a half of coming back into the government as an advisor. I mean, I saw things which I never thought I'd see. I thought that it was a laxity. There was a lack of interest basically a disinterest in the potential for our own biotechnology to proliferate to China from our Non-Proliferation Bureau at the State Department, run by Assistant Secretary Chris Ford. They approved much of the research that went on. So the Non-Proliferation Bureau has to clear on anything that has any potential proliferation concern. So there's two parts of the State Department that have to clear on cooperation with China.
All right. Well, let's go back to the time when you were doing the AVC investigation. I mean, as we sit here now, there's general acceptance that there are two theories on the table: a potential lab origin or human contact with an infected animal. But it wasn't always this case. And the fact that a lab leak is now considered a possibility is in large part because of the work you did, because of what you and your team uncovered at the State Department. David, I want to ask you, when you were investigating this, when you first started looking at this in late 2020, how much obstruction was there for you to even consider the possibility of a lab leak? And I'm talking about obstruction within the bureaucracy and within the intelligence agencies.
it wasn't outright obstruction. It was more of there was more people having deep concern that if we were to uncover certain facts that would implicate the United States in doing the exact same thing as the Chinese. They called this a can of worms. Pandora's box was once used by somebody. I never saw any evidence the United States government was doing anything suspicious for biological weapons-related applications with our funding. The only thing that I saw was that there was a level of incompetence in the government bureaucracy with aspects of biology and biological warfare that were documented in things like the 2018 National Academy of Sciences study, that were documented by the Chinese themselves in their 2011 Biological Weapons Convention declaration. The Chinese seem to know about this. Our top scientists seem to know about it. Our people in the government knew nothing. They were concerned about fish toxin proliferation. They were concerned about anthrax spores. Not that that's irrelevant, but in the world we're living in, where you could build a bioweapon in your laboratory in a matter of hours, actually. It might not be the most efficient bioweapon, but it would cause damage if it were released in any sort of advanced laboratory. The lack of cognition and understanding, appreciation at the strategic level that this could have resulted from not just a lab accident, but also from a program that had designs that was going to use advanced biology for malevolent purposes. Not that this necessarily it was deployed for that reason. Accidents happen along the way. Chernobyl was an accident. 3 Mile Island was an accident. We've had accidents at our Fort Detrick biological laboratories here involving biodefense. But an accident that occurs that no one knows about, that's covered up assiduously, is an act of, I would call it an act of great strategic concern to any foreign nation that's receiving on the receiving end of that accident, as is in the case of COVID-19.
So what obstacles did you face when investigating this?
So to get back to your question, though, real quick, because there was not, people didn't say shut this down. Chris Ford never said shut it down. He said, I welcome the investigation. The people that wanted it limited, though, were people in the intelligence community, because they said that we were second-guessing their analysis. Their analysis, as made public through the DNI, Director of National Intelligence, Ratcliffe statement to the Congress in April of 2020, was that this almost certainly had a natural zoonotic origin. So people were saying, well, you can't second-guess us. We're the intelligence community. And our reaction was, no, we're the arms control community. Our job is to second-guess you and to verify and comply everything that you're asserting. If you're telling us it came out of nature, you got to give us proof. If we find proof that there was a lab accident, that there was classified programs that they didn't declare, if we find proof that there was a very advanced research that had dual-use applications, we have a responsibility by law to report that, and it needs to be declared.
David Asher and his colleague Tom DiNanno obtained a bombshell classified report. It had been prepared by the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, America's biodefense labs. The report made the case that COVID-19 may have originated in a laboratory as a result of synthetic and serial passage gain-of-function biological research. The report went against the official scientific consensus at that point in time that the virus must have had a natural origin. While writing my book, I found out that after reviewing the report, Asher and DiNanno asked the laboratory to update this document on a sensitive conference call that also included members of the CIA, the National Intelligence Community, and the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. When DiNanno pressed the officials he dealt with at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence about why they had insisted the virus could not have been genetically manipulated, when the official view from America's foremost experts directly contradicted this, intelligence officials told him that the Livermore report was not a consensus document. They'd basically shelved it. Donano was outraged and argued that they were not in the consensus business and he was not interested in roundtable collective opinion. These conversations are detailed extensively in my book if you're interested in reading the full story. So, David, on this Lawrence Livermore report, when you and Donano and your team said to the intelligence agencies, well, what about this report? What did they say? Why didn't they want to bring it to anyone's attention?
They wanted to discount it because it was at odds with their analysis that was based on sort of vapid, we have a cartoon character named Dilbert in the United States. Their analysis was so ill-founded that whereas Lawrence Livermore, which had a meticulous documentation, it was prepared in part with actual real advanced biologists, who worked on biological weapons defense-related issues. They had, absolute state-of-the-art sequencing analysis going on in parallel to that report. So they had a whole unclassified parallel project that was very much in line with some of the research that we started to see from members of what ultimately became this DRASTIC group early on. How did the pangolin receptor binder domain get mixed in with the human fur and cleavage site under a backbone of a coronavirus derived derivative of SARS?
Just something to keep in mind here. David is speaking about a classified document prepared for the US government by its own biodefense laboratories. And he's making the claim that intelligence agencies just didn't want to know about it.
I'm not going to get into anything that's classified, but yes, they dealt with the issues of not just the intelligence, but also the science surrounding this, and why there was research going on at Wuhan Institute of Virology in particular that was consistent with things which could have led to an advanced variant of coronavirus like COVID-19 leaking out of the lab. That there was activity there to bioengineering, and it was activity that had, we'll call it a foggy purpose at best, maybe a malevolent purpose, at worst. And regardless of whether this was malevolent research or not, whatever leaked out of there was covered up in such a way that was totally consistent with a reaction to a lab leak. In terms of the way that, not just putting aside the information cover-up and smoke screen, I'm talking about just the way that they reacted by shutting down facilities, doing some sort of cleanup. It was all consistent with something very bad happening in a lab. And how did they know? Well, they run labs at Lawrence Livermore. They run a BSL-3 lab. And again, the lab that apparently had the leak was the BSL-2 and the BSL-3 labs at the old Wuhan Institute of Virology. So Lawrence Livermore was more than familiar with that laboratory and its procedures based on their own work. So when they said it looked like a lab leak, I took them seriously because they run laboratories.
Did they say it looked like it might have been a laboratory leak? My understanding is that they said one possibility is that this could have been a lab leak.
It could be. It could be. Their reporting is, I can't give you details, but I can say that their reporting was that it could well have been. And that was my interpretation of it as a person working to support policy. But when I talked to some of their
intelligence agencies had dismissed it because they said it wasn't a consensus document.
Yeah, but when I talked to some of the Lawrence Livermore leadership, which I did at length, they were much more vehement that this looked almost certainly like a lab leak. So when I talked to them personally, not on classified systems, just cell phone conversation on the weekend, not talking about classified, but what is your guess? I asked very senior people at Livermore, and they said, this looks like it was an accident. It looks like it was surrounding a program that had vast resources allocated to it to do very aggressive gain-of-function research to enhance pathogens with potential dual-use applications in mind from day one. And this was in large part shaped by their own understanding, as was ours, of the unclassified publications of the senior personnel of the Wuhan Institute. They were not exactly disguising their research.
But David, I just want to ask you about the reaction to that report from the intelligence community. Is it the case that they basically buried it?
They that's what they tend to do. There's a lot of groupthink that plagues the U.S. intelligence community and other intelligence communities around the world. People are afraid of any sort of out-of-the-box research, even when it's meticulously sourced. I mean, the work that the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories does is meticulous. It's scientific, and it's intelligence-based. So they combine both the state-of-the-art in science with a very advanced understanding of how biology could be applied for ill use by enemies and adversaries around the world. So they have an end-to-end capability to do this. We found that at most of the other agencies, they just sort of, unless we found a report that said 100% smoking gun, that this thing was a lab leak and it was tied into some hostile dual-use purpose, then it wasn't worth paying attention to. I mean, they just discounted it. And so basically, the way to make this simply understandable is there was so much smoke coming out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology by the time we really kicked off the elevated investigation in the middle of October of 2020. And smoke that continued billowing its way out of the doors of the Wuhan Institute in terms of intelligence, massively increasing in November. You couldn't see the gun because the entire place was on fire. I mean, it was obscured, but there was a lot of evidence, and where there's smoke, there is fire. And somehow, people in the intelligence community couldn't understand that. But they changed, one notices. As we were able to unearth, with their help actually, some very disturbing specifics, really starting in November and accelerating to December of 2020, specifics which were then later declassified by the Secretary of State and the Director of National Intelligence on January 15th, it became clearer to people that were paying attention that there was a empirical basis for assessing that there were events occurring in Wuhan that were consistent with this level of gain of function, which you see in COVID-19, that the research was based on military funding that was classified military funding. There were military personnel directly involved, and these were personnel that were not just involved in biodefense, but were known to be involved in biooffense. And whether this was an offensive vector that was deliberately leaked, we certainly had no information. But the fact that it was being developed at a level of gain of function, which any of us can see as you judge the deadliness to the world and the very difficult nature of trying to counter coronavirus 19 versus SARS. SARS killed you pretty quickly, but it sort of died out because of that. This thing with its asymptomatic spread, which is, in my analysis, something that the Chinese were working on.
David is referring to the fact that some people can be infected by COVID-19 but never show any symptoms. The virus can spread asymptomatically. This makes it different from many other coronavirus outbreaks. David claims this is an area of scientific research that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was delving into. He's about to refer to a term called interferon, which is basically how the human body triggers its own immune system to fight off viruses. David says Shezhengli did a paper on interferon response in 2008.
Altering interferon response was a paper. It was based on research that Dr. Shi originally wrote about in public in 2008. Why would anyone want to develop a ability for the interferon response of a human being's body to be fooled, i.e. for you to be sick and not know it, and for it to pass asymptomatically? Why would someone want to engineer that capability. But she herself worked on that in 2008. I have no idea why, but you put that together with what we see in COVID-19 and the other building blocks that she published on, in the years running up to the accident and the immersion of COVID-19 and the fall of 2019. You can see this train coming in public. You didn't need a security clearance, and this was one of the things that the folks at Lawrence Livermore emphasized to me. You don't need to see the classified records to understand that there's a high probability of an incredible, disturbing confluence of events that resulted in an accident and then a massive cover-up. And why else would the Chinese not want to find the origin of this through an investigation, including with global partners? The only reason they didn't want to find it is because they knew where it came from, in my estimation.
David, this wasn't the path I was going to go down, but now that you've raised it, that asymptomatic spread, the fact that you can be infected with the virus and never know it, never realize you're sick, this was something that initially threw the health officials, particularly in the United States. People like Redfield and Alex Azar and Anthony Fauci, they all didn't think there was asymptomatic spread. And when they discovered the virus was spreading asymptomatically, well, this was a game changer. It meant their whole containment strategy of isolating people who were feeling sick or had a temperature or were symptomatic was utterly redundant.
They said it doesn't happen with fresh viruses, newfound variants that emerge from nature into society. Dr. Fauci stressed in January of 2020 that it was asymptomatic spread was highly unlikely because that's not how coronaviruses spread. Well, in fact, this coronavirus did spread that way. So asymptomatic, as I understand it, talking to many doctors, which I have in the wake of, during our investigation and in the wake of it, you do see asymptomatic spread with influenza, for example. There's like 40% of people who get it don't know they have it initially, and they can spread it to somebody else. But in this case, we have sort of two types of asymptomatic spread. We have the people that don't know they've got it for 2 weeks as it develops in their bodies, even though they do have it. And then we have the 50% of the people that have it and never know they have it. So you got like this double whammy. And the question is, does that naturally occur with fresh viruses? And I'm convinced, based on discussions with many world experts, that is supernatural.
Beyond that,
that's not
you would
natural.
have seen this raised in that 2011 document, China's submission to the United Nations Biological Weapon Convention. They actually raised this.
They raised asymptomatic spread. They raised ethnic targeting. They raised all sorts of disturbing things, which, we had a lot of people that were just willfully ignorant, okay? And then we had people that were woefully ignorant. There's sort of a combination here. We had the sort of Dilberts and dimwits and do-nothings who were doing biology warfare-related research at the State Department as their career path, who didn't want to work. I mean, doing an investigation into COVID-19 required serious work, and you had to study up, you had to read scientific papers.
In November of 2020, David Asher and Tom Donano made the incredible discovery that an entire year earlier, workers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology had fallen sick and been hospitalized with COVID-like symptoms. Around 4 months after Asher and his team unearthed this intelligence from within the US government classified systems, I found out about it and broke the story on Sky News and on the front page of The Australian. It was March 2021 and it was a global scoop. The Wall Street Journal ended up re-reporting this on their front page about 2 months later in May 2021. But what was fascinating, and I can't emphasize this enough, is that this intelligence document had actually been in the possession of the US government for about an entire year, but nobody had recognized its significance. Asher did, and he brought it to the attention of very senior people within the administration. This intelligence, or part of it, was then declassified by Mike Pompeo and John Ratcliffe, and both of them speak about this in other episodes of this podcast when I interviewed them. David, I just want to get a sense of your emotion, your reaction when you discovered that classified intelligence report. Were you blown away? How did you feel?
Well, there was much more than a report. There were many reports, and they all started to point in the same direction. That there was a series of reports that were the origin behind our declassified fact sheet. That information that the U.S. had collected and allies had collected, but in this case it was U.S. information. People said it was Australian information. I will assure you it was not. It was U.S. government information because we can't declassify information that's not ours. But I'm sure it's information that your government was aware of in Australia and other Five Eyes partners. That the outbreak of COVID-19 appears to have originated inside the very laboratory in Wuhan that was involved in advanced coronavirus research on behalf of the People's Liberation Army, research that appeared to have malintentions. And for that reason, I was shocked. I was like, holy mackerel. I mean, we found something that might not constitute a smoking gun in the eyes of some analysts, but certainly from a policymaker's standpoint was extraordinarily disturbing. That this was not just a lab leak. This was a lab leak of a Frankenstein-like creature that had been manufactured for purpose that at least had dual use application to both offense and defense. And our understanding of the personnel involved in the program was that they had developed a gain of function variant of SARS that was so dangerous and had so many features that were in line with what I would call Chinese doctrine strategically, like stealth, asymptomatic spread, like an ability to have an effect of killing an enormous number of old people through ACE2, which this thing through a very odd spike protein which was extremely receptive in the ACE2 of human lungs, which seemed very unusual. I said, oh my God, this thing really looks like it was created. Now, it doesn't mean it wasn't created around a natural backbone. That would not be particularly difficult. If you use gain of function techniques, it's not difficult to enrich the pathogenicity of a coronavirus in a lab using humanized mice with lungs that are genetically similar to humans to create very specific effects that would be insidious if ever deployed in the context of a war. Now, so my concern was not that we were in the midst of a biological undeclared war. My concern was that the Chinese were doing research in, as we learned later, quite uncontrolled circumstances that was most definitely related to biological warfare ambitions in the future, and that they had had an accident of a secretive program that they never wanted anyone to know about because it was a weapon. And the weapon had gotten released errantly. I mean, it was like someone dropping a nuclear weapon out the back of a B-52 and bombing some city and saying, whoops, we didn't mean for that to occur.
I just want to go to the moment when you walked into Tom Donano's office to tell him about this incredible document.
When I walked into Donano's office, I said, well, lo and behold, look what happens when we actually task the intelligence community and they actually do their job meticulously, which they did, because we gave them orders to do that. And they actually respond to orders, interestingly. So people forget that. They when they're not left to their own discretion, and we never told them, give us this outcome. But when they're told, do meticulous research, look through your files, lo and behold, they find something. That's the amazing thing. We collect everything and know nothing in our governments these days. It's the big data problem. We're all drowning in it. So I was very surprised at the level of detail that they were able to produce around information that they had probably collected well over a year before that. Or a year before. So in November of 2020, we learned things that they had collected in November 2019. I was shocked by that. I was shocked because it reminded me of 9/11, and it reminded me as a historian of Pearl Harbor, where there had been early warning signs for years that had been ignored. There was information in the immediate run-up to 9/11 that al-Qaeda was planning to attack the United States and potentially other capital centers around the world, but certainly the United States was on the list, and that information had not been processed. I started to have the same nightmare in my head, as did my lead analyst, we'd worked on the war on terror together since 2005, we were just saying, holy crap, this can't really be happening. We knew this, but we didn't know it. I mean, it's like, that was my shock. My shock was that we had actually could have had foreknowledge. So where I was shocked was like, we could have known in November of 2019 that there was a disaster occurring inside Wuhan, inside their most important biological facilities related to coronavirus research that was, where something absolutely tragic, traumatic, and dramatic was occurring, and we could have reacted to it. I said we could have, the whole world could have been different. It would have been like stopping 9/11 before it happened. I mean, and what shocked me was that we had the means to know something, but we didn't either analyze it or disseminate it or even know that it was collected. That reminded me of my work at the State Department, where I was there on 9/11, watched a plane hit the Pentagon, and was part of the reaction in the Office of Secretary of State to it. I mean, and I led the effort against Al-Qaeda in Southeast Asia for the U.S. government after 9/11. But what bothered me and what bothered Dinano is that we could have done something differently if we had only been tasking the intelligence to begin with.
In October 2019, athletes from around 100 countries met in Wuhan for the World Military Games. When they flew back home, some of those athletes fell sick, and they later believed they were infected with COVID-19. They were never tested, even though athletes have blood samples taken routinely. I asked David Asher what he thinks about the theory that the virus started spreading globally as a result of the military games.
I mean, I didn't even know about the military games until someone from the Army called me in December of 2020 and asked me if I could explain what happened at the Wuhan military games and whether these people had fallen sick with an early emerging strain of COVID-19. And I said, sorry, I don't know anything about it. And that's the truth. I don't know. It is suspicious. I mean, we do see some indications in our own data, that NIH has, that there was COVID circulating in the United States, certainly in the earliest month of, as early as early December, possibly earlier than that. I mean, some of these people who came back from those games were sick with something. I've heard that from, people who've interviewed them, but I don't know the facts. I mean, the Army called me asking for what I knew, and I said I didn't know anything. So I'm not going to tell you I know anything that I don't know. It is suspicious. It is part of a pattern that would make sense. But unless the Biden administration has unearthed some proof that they're going to declassify on it, there's nothing that I know of either for or against that hypothesis.
Towards the end of your investigation at the State Department, you had contact with 3 presumed whistleblowers. How did each of these interactions come about?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't call them whistleblowers. These were people that were just. It's uncertain to really know. There were 2 people that were suspicious to me. One person there were 3 people, as you mentioned, that reached out through social media and said that they had information, and 2 of them came through a third party, a government in Asia that is a friend of the United States. And this was after I'd left the State Department. I mean, I did inform the State Department that I'd heard it. And, people got on WhatsApp, in my case, and then I think they were on some other device, and they put the phones together. And, I heard some interesting stories that this was tied to a PLA program, that it was a huge accident, and that the workers fell sick at the Wuhan Institute, that were working on it. But, it's also possible that was, misinformation coming out of the Chinese themselves, because, it was sort of saying, plausibly this was an accident. We didn't intend for this to happen. We were the first people to get sick. Don't blame us. We didn't realize the magnitude of what this thing meant at the beginning. I mean, it sounded, frankly, to me, sort of exculpatory. Okay, it's like when a criminal says, I didn't murder that lady. People say things like that on a recorded phone line, knowing that someone like me would be a willing, an interested party to hear that information and might spread it around. But I took the opposite angle on it. The one source I heard from that was most convincing to me was someone who'd actually been on the ground in Wuhan when this occurred, who had very good relations with Wuhan Institute of Virology. Maybe they worked on science research together collaboratively, and they heard from their counterparts that they were falling sick with some SARS reoccurrence in early November of 2019, and that they didn't know what it was. They feared it was SARS. And, if it wasn't SARS, as we learned in retrospect, it was COVID-19, but that is a variant of SARS. But they had a SARS-like, loss of, sensation, and they were had very, significant lung infections. And, that struck me as much more credible. And even more recently, I've heard from a few people that were foreign business people in Wuhan, including an American business person, who knew socially some of the people at the Wuhan Institute and some of the people at the Wuhan Institute of Biological Products that fell sick very early on in November. So the information sort of making its way in through people, but you gotta be careful, because we can't use the rumor mill or things that we pick up through social media or things like that as authoritative, certainly in a government that's so prone to disinformation as China, the People's Republic of China.
But the first contact, the first one, corroborated the information about the Wuhan Institute of Virology workers falling sick, and that intermediary was someone you trusted and you'd known for a very long time.
The people I know, the first source was the one I trusted. The other two, I really had no foggy clue.
So do you want to tell me a bit more about that first one there?
No, I can't really. Okay, I'm not going to. We're not going to give up. People who's. I'm not going to betray the trust of anybody who provided significant information as part of our ongoing investigation. I mean, we're continuing the investigation at the Hudson Institute. We're working very closely with folks on Capitol Hill. We don't have the power that we had in the government, but we have a lot of willing sources of information.
David, I'm interested in your view on this. Do you think this was most likely a leak from the development of a vaccine, or a leak from the development of a bioweapons program, or just innocent research that was designed to prevent a pandemic? What's your overall concluding assessment?
I'm convinced the Chinese have a very advanced biological warfare program involving synthetic biology, gain of function techniques centered around enriching the virulence of coronaviruses and other viruses that have, including Ebola, MERS, Zika. This is not based on any classified information I have. The reality is, I wish we had better classified information of the nature of the Chinese biological weapons program, but I wouldn't talk about it if we did. But I will say that if you just look at all the other research they declared as biodefense related, with the exception of coronaviruses, which they stopped declaring in 2016 as biodefense related, Zika, Marburg, Ebola, they're working on all these things. And given what we've learned from the way the Chinese have handled or mishandled the outbreak of COVID-19 and its origins centered around their own national laboratories in Wuhan, we've got to assume that this is hardly the end of the story. Whatever the Chinese are doing now has got to be much worse than what we saw here as a result of an accident. I mean, the accident was bad. My sense of what they're working on, just based on their own publications and what they've declared in 2011 to the Biological Weapons Convention, is far more malevolent level capabilities involving diseases which are literally unstoppable unless vaccinated for, and the vaccines are going to be extremely difficult to develop for certain types of diseases that they're looking at. They're looking at things that are involving virus-like particles, for example. They're very different from a virus. That they're going to, and things like prions and other things that you see research coming out of Chinese labs, and things like making spoofing interferon response, which Dr. Shi wrote about in 2008. I mean, if you just look at what they're actually writing about and who those people are, including, of course, one of the most famous researchers who's based in Australia at your National Animal Laboratory, who's been a frequent collaborator of Dr. Shi. I have no sense that individual's motivations are ill-purposed at all, but they're doing very radical research into the potential biological evolution.
So just to sum this up, you believe this was an accidental leak of a virus from a bioweapons research program rather than the result of research to develop a vaccine?
No, I think it was being developed as a part of a dual-use program with the end goal of developing very advanced, sublime, sophisticated, and even indeed sinister capabilities that would mate the Chinese goal of hybrid warfare with biology. So it would be stealth, it would be elusive, it would be hard to attribute to anyone. So, essentially it's a covert virus, capability that could be used in the context of a future war to undermine the economies of adversaries. I think that's what the Chinese are working on, and they haven't stopped to work on it. They're continuing to work on it. And you can see it, in their own reaction. The fact that they've covered this thing up is a clear indication to me that they got something to hide. And the question is, what is it that they got to hide? And my view is they've got something to hide that involves the use of biology and synthetic biology at all levels of sophistication that you can imagine, and in things which probably no one can imagine, that they feel will help them attrit our economic resources in the case that a war breaks out, let's say in the Taiwan Strait, and the United States decides to respond. They have the ability, not just through cyberspace, but through biospace, to attack our countries in their most vulnerable positions, which is through our economy and our social confidence.
As you've heard, David Asher is incredibly passionate about investigating this topic. He was shattered when his task force was shut down by the incoming Biden administration when Trump lost the election. Asher is now at a prestigious Washington-based think tank, the Hudson Institute, where he's a senior fellow. I've interviewed him more than a dozen times over the past year, and even though he's no longer in government, he continues to doggedly investigate how the pandemic started. What Really Happened in Wuhan is presented by The Australian. It's written and produced by me, Shari Markson, and The Australian's editorial director, Claire Harvey. It was produced by Leah Samaglu. My book, What Really Happened in Wuhan, is available online at Amazon, in bookstores in Australia at Dimox, or wherever you buy your books.